My mother-in-law threw hot tea at me, calling me a disgraceful daughter, shouting, "You bring shame to our family." That same day, my novel hit #1 on the bestseller list. The next day, she pretended to have always supported me. "You should be proud of me, Callum." "I am proud of you," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "Then why didn't you say anything when she threw tea at me?" He looked down at his hands, fingers clasped too tightly. I already knew the answer. I want to start this post by saying I never imagined I'd be writing here. For years, I was the quiet type who preferred to watch chaos unfold on Reddit rather than participate. But lately, my life has felt like a thread you'd see blow up here, one where you read the title twice and wonder how the hell it got to that point. I'm 42. I've been married to Callum for almost 12 years. We don't have kids, which has been a point of contention in his family. I'm a writer, though until recently, I wasn't a successful one. I worked part-time editing academic papers to help with bills, and I wrote fiction during the hours people usually spend sleeping. My husband comes from a very different world. His family is old money Boston, Beacon Hill stock. His mother, Doreen, could be described as someone who always expected perfection from her family and had zero tolerance for anything that didn't reflect well on her image. She didn't like me from the start. I'm not from money. I grew up in a little town called Millinocket, Maine. My dad was a mechanic, my mom a lunch lady. I worked for everything I had, including my education. I've always felt Doreen saw me as less than, even though she was never explicitly cruel, at least, not until recently. Callum, to his credit, used to stand up for me. But that's changed over time, and I've come to realize something unsettling. The more I grew into myself, the more tension brewed between us. What happened 2 weeks ago still plays in my head like a movie I didn't ask to be part of. We were at his parents' house for the usual Sunday lunch. Everything was painfully formal, as always. I hadn't seen Doreen since the news broke that my debut novel had hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It was surreal. I should have been celebrating. I was celebrating, until lunch. I was dressed in a simple cream blouse and navy pants. Nothing flashy. I wasn't there to gloat. But the moment Doreen saw me, I knew she was going to say something. She looked me over like she was inspecting produce. "So," she said, spooning sugar into her tea, "I read your book." I wasn't sure how to respond. "Oh?" She set the spoon down with an audible clink. Interesting choice to include a character so similar to me. At first, I was confused. Then I realized she meant Beatrice, a bitter, controlling matriarch in the novel. I hadn't written to her about Doreen, but now that she mentioned it, the resemblance was there. Unintentional, but uncanny. "I didn't base her on you," I said honestly. "Don't lie to me, Mariel." Her voice was sharp. "You humiliate this family in print, and then you sit here expecting us to pretend we support this disgrace?" I was stunned. My fork hovered midair. Callum didn't speak. No one did. Then, she picked up her teacup and flung the contents at me. Hot chamomile splashed onto my blouse and neck. I gasped. It wasn't boiling, but it burned enough to sting. Callum stood, finally. "Mother!" "What the hell?" But he didn't come to my side. He didn't grab a towel. He didn't ask if I was okay. I stood up, tea dripping down my arm. I wasn't angry, just numb. I looked at Doreen, then at Callum. And I walked out of the room. I drove home alone. I didn't cry. I think I was too shocked. The moment that should have been one of the best in my life, finally being recognized for the years I'd poured into my craft, had been hijacked by a woman who couldn't bear to let go of her control. And the man who promised to be my partner had just let it happen. Later that evening, I checked my phone. Dozens of messages from readers, my publisher, friends, fellow authors. People celebrating my success. And in between all that joy, one voicemail from Doreen. "Mariel, I'm sorry if I was harsh. I just think you have a lot of potential, and I want the best for this family. I've always believed in your talent. I played the message 3 times, just to be sure I'd heard it right. The next day, she posted a photo of my book on Facebook with a caption, "So proud of my daughter-in-law Mariel for her incredible debut novel. We always knew she had it in her." Callum saw it, smiled faintly, and said, "She's trying." But the damage had been done. The next few days were a blur of interviews, emails, contract talks about film rights. All the things I'd dreamed of. But I felt strangely alone in it all. My husband didn't ask about my meetings. He didn't want to talk about the next book I was planning. He was quieter than usual, but not in a supportive, steady way, more like someone watching a storm from a distance, unsure whether to move closer or walk away. I brought it up one night. I asked him point blank, "Do you even like that I'm successful now?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's just a lot. It's all happening so fast." I asked him why he didn't say anything when his mother threw tea at me. He said, "I didn't want to make it worse. I wanted to scream." "Make it worse?" "She assaulted me, and you stood there." What's messing with my head the most is that I've worked so hard for this moment, this life. I didn't write to be famous. I wrote because I needed to tell stories. But now that I've succeeded, I feel more isolated than ever. My husband is distant. My mother-in-law is suddenly supportive because it suits her image. And I'm sitting here wondering if the price of my success is the person I thought I could rely on the most. I'm not looking for sympathy, just clarity. I don't know what to do next. I love Callum, but I feel like we've grown into two very different people. And part of me is terrified that success has only made those cracks more visible. Should I confront Doreen? Is it worth salvaging things with Callum? Am I overreacting by feeling betrayed? I could really use your advice. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, the ceiling fan spinning quietly above me. Callum had his back turned, breathing steady like he was sound asleep, or pretending to be. I kept replaying the moment over and over again, the cup, the heat of the tea, the silence, the look in Doreen's eyes. And the fact that no one moved. It wasn't just the act of her throwing the tea. It was what it symbolized. Years of belittlement and subtle jabs had finally boiled over into something physical. And it was almost like she knew she could get away with it. Why? Because I'd never stood up to her? Because I'd tolerated every backhanded comment with a tight smile and a clenched jaw for over a decade? Or because her son, my husband, never once told her to stop? The next morning, I went through the motions. I made coffee, sat at the breakfast table, phone in hand, staring at the interview requests piling into my inbox. CNN wanted a 5-minute spot. A popular literary podcast asked to fly me out to New York. My publisher was giddy. My agent called me the voice of the year. And yet, I felt small. Callum finally wandered into the kitchen, hair still messy, pulling on a sweatshirt. "Morning," he said, like nothing had happened. I looked at him, watched the way he poured himself coffee without even asking how I was doing, and suddenly, I couldn't pretend anymore. "You really didn't think to check in with me after what happened yesterday?" He paused mid-pour. "I figured you'd want space." I swallowed. "She threw tea at me, Callum." He looked tired. "I know. It was out of line." I stared. "Out of line?" He turned, leaned against the counter, and sighed. "What do you want me to say, Mariel? That she's horrible? That I hate how she treats you? That I wish she weren't like that? That would be a start. She's my mother. It's complicated." I stood up, walked past him to the sink, and set my mug down gently. "You didn't even come after me when I left. You didn't call. You didn't ask if I was okay." He looked down, then met my eyes. I didn't know what to say. The silence between us stretched. It felt like a canyon. "You didn't have to say anything," I said. "You just had to do something." He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes clouded with guilt or maybe just exhaustion. I couldn't tell anymore. That day, I didn't do any of the things I was supposed to do. I didn't respond to emails. I didn't return calls. I sat in my writing room and stared out the window, wondering when my life had turned into a balancing act between achievement and emotional starvation. I used to fantasize about this success. Not the money or the fame, but the validation. The proof that the years of loneliness and rejection had meant something. I used to think if I made it big, I'd finally feel like I belonged somewhere. Like I mattered. But now? I felt like I'd climbed a mountain only to find the summit empty. Windy. Cold. Doreen kept posting about me. That week alone, she made 3 more posts, at the bookstore picking up more copies of Mariel's amazing novel. Dinner with the author herself, so proud of the woman my son married. Reading club featuring The Ashes We Carry, can't wait to discuss. Each one made me feel nauseous. Like I was being used to launder her public image. Like the tea-throwing incident had been a figment of my imagination, or worse, something I had provoked. I didn't know how to process it. A few nights later, we were at home, eating leftover Thai on the couch. The TV was on but muted. I wasn't eating. I'd lost my appetite. Callum took a bite of the pad CEW and asked, "Are you okay?" I turned to him. No, he set down his fork. "Are we okay?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "I think so. I hope so." That's not the same as yes. He leaned back. I didn't sign up for this level of attention. Your name is everywhere. People recognize you now. Your world's changed. I felt my throat tighten. And you didn't think it would? You knew I was a writer. I thought you'd publish a book or 2, maybe teach a class. I didn't think you'd become this. This? I asked. What's this? He hesitated. Someone I don't recognize. It wasn't said with cruelty. It was quiet, almost apologetic. But it cut all the same. I turned back to the screen, heart pounding. I've always been this person, Callum. You just didn't see her. Neither of us spoke after that. The next day, Doreen called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, cheerful, chirpy, like we were best friends. She asked if I wanted to do a joint appearance with her at a local women's club event, talk about how families support creative dreams. I laughed out loud when I heard it. A bitter, stunned laugh. I played it back, just to make sure I hadn't misheard. I hadn't. I forwarded the voicemail to my friend Harper, who's known me since college. She called immediately and asked if I wanted her to drive over and scream at Doreen for me. Instead, I just asked her, "Am I going crazy?" "No," Harper said. "You're just finally waking up. The thing is, I'm not sure I want to be awake. Because once you see things clearly, there's no going back. And what I see now is a woman who fought her whole life to be heard. And a marriage that worked best when I was quiet. And now that I'm not quiet? Now that I'm finally being heard? I think I'm starting to lose everything else." I started sleeping in the guest room. Not because we were fighting. Not even because I wanted to make a statement. But because one night I just didn't want to be near him. And when the next night came, it felt easier to stay where I was. Callum didn't ask questions. He didn't protest. He just said, "Okay," when I told him I needed space. That simple word told me everything. Not that he didn't care, necessarily. But he had no idea how to care in the way I needed. And maybe he never had. I kept thinking about all the years I tried to shrink myself to fit into his family's world. How I changed how I dressed, how I spoke, how I laughed. I even practiced small talk in the mirror before family dinners, just to avoid the awkward silences when Doreen inevitably made me feel like an outsider. I remembered when we first got married and I showed Doreen a short story I was proud of. She read it, smiled without showing her teeth, and said, "So creative. But wouldn't it be more productive to write something more uplifting? Women read too many sad stories these days." I should have known then. But love is a funny thing. It can make you forget who you are, bit by bit, until one day you wake up and realize you've been whispering in a world that was never going to listen. The book tour dates started rolling in. My agent was ecstatic. "This is it, Mariel," she said over the phone. "You're going to be one of those names people know. We're already getting inquiries from Europe." I should have been over the moon. But instead, I felt like I was floating just above my life, looking down at a version of myself who didn't know what the hell she was doing anymore. That weekend, there was another lunch invite from Doreen. This time, she suggested a celebration brunch at a restaurant in Back Bay. "My treat," she wrote in her email, "I want to show you how proud I am of you." I didn't respond. I forwarded it to Callum with a one-line message, "Are you going?" He replied, "She just wants to make things right." I didn't go. He did. When he came home later that afternoon, I asked how it went. "She's trying," he said again, that same worn-out line, like a scratched record. "She told the waiter all about your book. Had it on the table next to the mimosas. She threw tea at me 6 days ago," I reminded him. "She was emotional. She salted me, Callum." He didn't argue. He didn't defend her. But he didn't agree either. We sat in that heavy silence again, and I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before: Callum would never take a side. Not really. Not when it involved conflict between me and his mother. He lived in the space between the neutral ground, where everything was brushed under the rug and people smiled even when they were screaming inside. I couldn't live there anymore. That night, I opened a blank document and began writing something new. Not fiction. Not even a draft. Just words. My own words. About what had happened. About how I felt. I poured it all out without structure, without intention. And when I read it back, I cried for the first time since that Sunday lunch. Because it wasn't just the tea. It wasn't just the book. It was every moment over the past 12 years where I had quietly put myself second. Every dinner where I laughed off a joke that made me feel small. Every time I let myself believe that if I just worked harder, or spoke softer, or stayed quiet a little longer, I'd finally be accepted. And now? I had success. I had readers who liked my work. I had validation from strangers and bookstores and publishers. But in my own home, I felt like a stranger. Harper came over the next day. She brought coffee and donuts and a quiet kind of energy that didn't ask for anything in return. We sat on the back porch, wrapped in blankets, as the late April wind rustled through the trees. "I'm worried I'm outgrowing him," I said. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she asked, "Or maybe you're just growing into yourself." That hit me hard. "I don't want to throw away a decade," I said, my voice small. "You're not throwing anything away," she replied gently. "You're just not letting someone else decide who you get to be anymore." We sat there in the quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt steady. But that night, I opened the door to the guest room and found Callum sitting on the edge of the bed. He looked up, his face tired, like he hadn't slept well either. "I don't know how to be with someone who doesn't need me the way they used to," he said. I stood in the doorway, stunned. Not by what he said, but by how clearly it explained everything. "I didn't marry you because I needed you," I said softly. "I married you because I wanted you." He looked down, jaw tight. "But now you don't." I didn't respond. Because maybe that was the question we had been circling all along: did we still want each other? Or had our marriage become something we were just used to, something we didn't know how to let go of? I wish I had the answer. I really do. The next few days passed in an odd rhythm, like walking through a house after it's been rearranged while you were asleep. Nothing looked drastically different, but nothing felt quite the same either. Callum and I became polite strangers. We exchanged basic updates: who was picking up groceries, who had what appointments, but avoided any conversation that scraped too close to the truth. It was easier that way. Safer. He didn't ask about the upcoming book tour stops. He didn't mention the article in Boston Magazine that called me a bold new voice in American fiction. And I didn't push. I suppose there was a part of me still hoping he'd come around on his own. That he'd wake up and realize what it meant that I'd spent years fighting for something I believed in, and won. That he'd finally look at me with the same pride he used to show when I got published in obscure literary journals no one read, back when I was still invisible to the rest of the world. Instead, he stayed quiet. Withdrawn. Resentful, maybe. Or scared. Or both. One evening, I got an email from a small bookshop in Portland, Maine, my hometown, inviting me to do a reading and Q&A. They said they'd followed my career from the beginning and were thrilled to finally welcome me back. It hit me harder than I expected. Home. I hadn't been back in years. Not since my father passed. My mother had moved to Florida to live with my sister, and I didn't have much reason to return. But something about that email felt grounding. Like a reminder of the person I was before all of this. I booked the trip without asking Callum if he wanted to come. I didn't even tell him I was going until the day before. "I'll be in Maine for a few days," I said, setting my suitcase by the front door. He looked up from his laptop, brow furrowed. "What for?" "Reading event. They invited me." He hesitated. "You're going alone?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, almost absently. "Okay. Safe travels." And that was it. No offer to join me. No questions about where I'd be staying. No good luck or "I'm proud of you." Just okay. I drove up the next morning, and as I passed into Maine, I felt something in me start to loosen. I hadn't realized how tightly wound I'd become until I saw the pine trees again, the rocky coastline, the little roadside diners I used to pass on my way to community college. Portland was colder than Boston, and quieter. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you could breathe deeper. I stayed in a cozy little inn on Congress Street and spent the afternoon walking along the waterfront, revisiting old haunts, the used bookstore I used to work at, the coffee shop where I once wrote the first draft of my novel on the back of receipt paper. The event that night was small but warm. Maybe 20 people, seated in folding chairs between bookshelves. I read a chapter from the book. Then we opened it up for questions. Someone in the back, an older woman with salt and pepper hair, raised her hand. "Did you base the mother character on someone specific in your life?" I felt my mouth go dry. The room was quiet, expectant. I took a breath. "Not exactly. She's more of a composite. She represents a certain kind of woman, one who hides cruelty behind control, who believes appearances are everything, even at the cost of love." A few people nodded. One woman wiped her eyes. Later, someone came up to me as I was signing books. "I left my husband 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Reading your story gave me permission to stop apologizing for growing." I don't think she knew how much that meant to me. That night, back in my hotel room, I stared at my phone, debating whether or not to call Callum. I wanted to tell him about the event. The woman with the salt and pepper hair. The little boy in the front row who asked if I'd write a book about pirates next. But I didn't. I climbed into bed and turned out the light. The next morning, there was a message waiting on my phone from Doreen. A voice memo. I didn't want to open it. But curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was calm, syrupy. "Mariel, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'd really like to talk, woman to woman. I know you're hurt. And maybe I said some things I shouldn't have. But we're family. And family sticks together, especially now that the world is watching." I played it twice, stunned by the sheer audacity. Especially now that the world is watching. That line repeated in my mind all the way back to Boston. When I got home, Callum was in the kitchen. He looked up when I came in, but didn't get up. How was it? He asked. Good. Your mom called me, he said after a beat. I raised an eyebrow. Why? She said she left you a message. She's trying to reach out. I took off my coat slowly. She's trying to save face. He didn't argue. Do you think I should call her back? I asked, watching his reaction carefully. He hesitated. I think it'd be easier if you could forgive her. There it was. Easier for who? He didn't answer. I nodded. That's what I thought. I went upstairs and unpacked my suitcase slowly, placing each item back where it belonged. But nothing felt like it belonged anymore. Not the clothes in my closet. Not the books on the shelves. Not the silence in the room next door. And as I folded the last sweater and slid the suitcase under the bed, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit out loud. I had changed. But Callum hadn't. And somewhere along the way, we stopped changing together. That night, I lay in bed, awake long after the street lights turned off. The quiet of the house wasn't comforting anymore, it felt vacant, like it echoed with all the things we no longer said. I thought about how many times I'd waited for someone in this family to defend me. To see me. To care. And I realized I was done waiting. So I got up, made tea, not chamomile, and sat at my desk. The same desk where the ashes we carry had been born. And I started to write again. But this wasn't fiction. It was true. A memoir. A tally honest account of the life behind the book. Not to settle scores, but to speak plainly. About toxic in-laws. About silent spouses. About the cost of staying small for the comfort of others. I didn't use real names. I didn't have to. The details were sharp enough for anyone who knew the players. And I wrote it for women like me. Women who were told they were too much, too emotional, too ambitious. Women who were taught to wait their turn. To be grateful for crumbs. The working title? The Teacup Incident. My agent loved it. My publisher? Even more so. It's bold, they said. Raw. Relatable. Doreen found out about it in the most fitting way, a press release. She called me within an hour. I heard about your new project, she said, her tone clipped. I sipped my tea. Yes. It's personal. A reflection on growth, boundaries, and the damage of generational silence. She was quiet for a beat. Then, you're going to make us look terrible. I'm going to tell the truth. You're exploiting this family for fame. No. I'm reclaiming my story. Click. I didn't hear from her again for a while. Callum, on the other hand, was struggling. The distance between us had become undeniable. He still didn't ask about the book. He still avoided eye contact when I mentioned events. He looked like a man trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through his fingers. We had dinner one night, quietly pushing roasted vegetables around our plates. Then he asked, "Why are you doing this?" The memoir? Because people need to know they're not alone. But it'll make things worse. For who? He couldn't answer. A week later, I sat him down. I want a separation, I said. Calmly. Firmly. He looked shocked. Not devastated, just surprised. Like he never thought I'd actually go through with it. I still love you, he said. I believe you, I replied. But you love the version of me who stayed quiet. She's not coming back. The papers were signed within the month. I moved out of our Beacon Hill home and into a 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, walking distance to 3 bookstores and a little cafe that knew my order by heart. I dedicated the memoir to the woman I used to be, and every woman who's still waiting to speak. The Teacup Incident launched 6 months later. It sold out in 2 days. It hit #1 again, twice as fast as my first novel. The media loved it. Book clubs couldn't stop talking about it. I was invited to speak at universities, women's panels, even a TEDx event. People showed up crying, sharing their own stories. And the sweetest part? I was booked for a private event in Boston, a fundraising gala hosted by a women's leadership nonprofit. I was the keynote speaker. Guess who was on the board of directors? Doreen. I didn't know she'd be there until I arrived. I saw her near the entrance, wearing pearls and a frozen smile, eyes going wide when she saw me on the poster near the ballroom. "Mariel," she said, recovering quickly. "What a surprise." I smiled. "Didn't they tell you? I'm the main event." She stammered something about the schedule being vague. I just walked past her, head high, heart light. My speech wasn't about her. Not directly. But every word hit its mark. I spoke about silencing yourself to make others comfortable. About the courage it takes to leave behind people who only love the idea of you, not the real version. About the strength in reclaiming your narrative. The room gave me a standing ovation. Doreen didn't speak to me the rest of the night. She didn't have to. I had finally said everything I needed to say, on my terms, in my voice, without begging anyone to listen. As for Callum? We met for coffee a few months after the divorce finalized. He looked smaller. Worn. He told me he was seeing a therapist. That he realized how much he'd let his mother control his life. That he was trying to be better. I wished him well. And I meant it. Because revenge, I've learned, isn't about hurting someone back. It's about healing so thoroughly, so powerfully, that the person who tried to silence you has no choice but to watch you rise, louder, stronger, unshakable. These days, I drink tea often. And I always finish the cup,